China has a very peculiar way of fighting a territorial dispute. Sometimes it will send soldiers, sometimes it builds roads, and sometimes it changes the names on a map. Now, in August 2026, India formally standardized the name of 27 geographical locations in Arunachal Pradesh on an updated Survey of India map. China's state-run media immediately hit back, calling India's move unilateral and warning that it could complicate border negotiation.
On August 7th, India formally identified 27 locations in Arunachal Pradesh by their standard Indian names on the official Indian map.
China has been arguing over Arunachal Pradesh for decades now. So why does a list of place names matters so much? Because this isn't really a dispute about names. It is a dispute about territory, history, sovereignty, and strategic control. And to understand why the small northeastern state has become one of the most sensitive pieces of territory between two nuclear powers, we need to go back more than a century. Now, to understand this India and China border dispute, we first need to understand one term, the McMahon Line. In 1914, representatives of British India and Tibet participated in the Simla Convention. Now, the British India representative, Henry McMahon, negotiated a boundary between Tibet and British India. This became known as McMahon Line. India considers this line as the base of boundary in the eastern sector between China and India. China, however, does not accept it. And this disagreement is fundamental because there is an important historical nuance here. The dispute did not originally look exactly like today's India-China dispute, because in 1914, Tibet was functioning with considerable autonomy, while the People's Republic of China did not yet exist at all. After the Communist Revolution in 1949, Beijing established control over Tibet, and suddenly the old India-Tibet frontier became an India-China frontier. Now that dramatically changed the entire strategic equation between India and China. Now, the 1950s initially looked very different. India and China spoke about Asian solidarity. They spoke about Panchsheel, Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai. But beneath the diplomatic optimism, the territorial disagreement was becoming increasingly serious. China constructed the Aksai Chin Road, linking Xinjiang and Tibet. India discovered the road and then protested. Meanwhile, China rejected India's position on large portions of the frontier, including the eastern sector. And by 1962, the relationship had actually collapsed. China launched a major offensive against India in October of 1962. The Eastern Theatre included what was then the Northeast Frontier Agency, NEFA, the territory that would later become Arunachal Pradesh. Now, Chinese forces advanced to several areas, including Tawang, and then in November 1962, Beijing announced a unilateral ceasefire and then a withdrawal. Now, in the eastern sector, Chinese troops eventually withdrew north of the McMahon Line, but the fundamental boundary dispute remained unresolved, and it is unresolved till today. And this is critical. The line of actual control, LAC, is not the same thing as an agreed international boundary. It is essentially the line up to which each side exercises actual control. But India and China do not have an identical perception of where the LAC lies in every sector. Now, that ambiguity is one of the reasons confrontations continue till date between two nuclear powers. Now, the story doesn't end in 1962. In 1986, another serious confrontation occurred in the Samdorong-Chu Valley in Arunachal Pradesh. Chinese troops established a presence in that area. India responded with a major military deployment, of course, and for several months, the two armies faced each other in a highly tense situation. But again, war was avoided in 1986. And there was an important political development. In 1986, Parliament passed legislation covering Arunachal Pradesh and converting it into a full state. And it formally became a state in February of 1987. Now, China objected strongly to India's move, but the crisis eventually de-escalated. And this period taught countries something very, very important. Military pressure could create a crisis, but diplomacy could prevent that crisis from becoming a war. Now, that lesson became the foundation of next phase of Indo-China relationship, which will be continuing till today. Now, after Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's 1988 visit to China, the two countries began constructing mechanisms to prevent their unresolved border from becoming a battlefield. This produced a remarkable series of agreements between India and China. In 1993, India and China signed an agreement on maintenance of peace and tranquility alongside the LOC. In 1996, they signed an agreement on confidence-building measures in the military field. And then came the 2005 Agreement on Political Parameters and Guiding Principles for Resolving the Boundary Question. And eventually in 2013, another agreement focused on border defense cooperation. Now the basic idea was that we don't have to solve the border immediately, but while we are negotiating, let's prevent soldiers from fighting over it. And for several years, this agreement largely worked. There were patrol face-offs, occasional incidents. Basically, the two sides avoided a major military confrontation. And then came the year of 2020. In 2020, India-China border relationship suffered its biggest crisis in decades. Chinese and Indian forces confronted each other at multiple points in eastern Ladakh. The most dramatic incident occurred in Galwan Valley on 15th of June 2020. Indian and Chinese troops, they engaged in a violent clash. Around 21 Indian soldiers were killed. China also acknowledged casualties, although its officially announced figures were lower. The significance was enormous. The old assumption that border agreements had created a relatively stable military relationship was actually shattered. India subsequently increased military deployments and infrastructure along the northern frontier. And China did the same. And now the border was no longer merely a diplomatic problem. It had become a long-term military competition. But then the question is, why Arunachal? Now to understand this, now we return to the northeast. Why does China care so much about Arunachal Pradesh? That is the question. Now, because Beijing claims the entire state as part of what it calls as Zangnan, or the southern Tibet. India's position is completely opposite. New Delhi considers Arunachal Pradesh an integral and inalienable part of India, and the geography makes the region strategically important. Arunachal Pradesh covers around 83,743 square kilometers, but has only a population density of 17 people per square kilometer. That is according to the government data based on 2011 census. Now it is mountainous Arunachal Pradesh, it is remote and extremely difficult to access, but strategically it sits at the eastern end of India-China frontier. The state includes Tawang. Tawang has enormous geographical, cultural and strategic significance, and it also is a home to Tawang Monastery, one of the most important centers of Tibetan Buddhism outside Tibet. This gives the region an additional layer of sensitivity because the question of Tibetan Buddhism is deeply connected to China's political concerns over Tibet. See now what has happened. India standardized the name of 27 locations in Arunachal Pradesh on an official survey of India map, according to the reports. Now the locations include geographical features such as mountain passes and high altitude lake. China reacted very strongly. Its state-run Global Times described India's action as unilateral and argued that the locations lie in China's claimed Zangnan region. Now here's the important analytical point. Changing the name does not really legally transfer sovereignty. A map or a place name by itself cannot magically create territorial ownership. But maps matter politically. They communicate, this is our territory, this is how we will officially identify it. And China has itself repeated using names as part of its territorial narrative. See, since 2017, Beijing has issued multiple batches of standardized Chinese names for locations in Arunachal Pradesh. India has repeatedly rejected these moves. For example, in 2023, India's Ministry of External Affairs said that assigning invented names would not change the reality that Arunachal Pradesh is an integral part of India. So the latest Indian move can be understood partly as a catastrophic counter response. China says, we name it, therefore it is ours. India's response is effective. We administer it, we govern it, and officially map it as a part of India. The real contest is therefore not about vocabulary. It is about competing territorial narratives. Now, but there is another dimension that is often missed. A border is not secured merely by soldiers. It is secured by roads, bridges, telecommunication, airports, villages, and economic activity. This is particularly important in Arunachal Pradesh. India's Vibrant Villages program is designed to strengthen infrastructure and livelihood in villages along with the national border. See, out of the 662 priority villages initially identified under the program, around 450 plus are in Arunachal Pradesh. The program includes roads, connectivity, housing, energy, telecom, healthcare, education, and livelihood opportunities. The question is why? Because in a remote border region, population itself can have strategic significance. A functioning village creates a permanent civilian presence. A road allows faster movement of troops. A communication network improves surveillance, and infrastructure therefore serves both developmental and strategic purposes. But then the question is, who is winning. Now, this is where we need to avoid simplistic nationalism. The India-China border dispute cannot be reduced to, is China aggressive or India is weak? The reality is much more complicated. China possesses enormous economic and military capabilities, that is for sure. It has developed extensive infrastructure across Tibet. India, meanwhile, has significantly accelerated its own border infrastructure and military preparedness. And both countries have powerful incentives to avoid a full-scale war. Remember, both are nuclear-armed forces, nuclear-armed states. And China is India's largest or amongst the largest trading partner, despite the political tensions. So actually, if you see into perspective, the relationship between India and China contains a paradox. Strategic rivalry and economic interdependence exist simultaneously. That is why India continues diplomatic engagement even while strengthening its military position. In fact, as recently as August 2026, India and China held another round of discussions on border affairs, covering boundary delimitation, border management, and mechanisms for maintaining stability. So diplomacy hasn't disappeared. It is simply operating alongside military competition. And let us now try to answer the bigger question. And perhaps this is the most important question. After more than 100 years since the McMahon Line was drawn, over 6 decades since 1962 war, and decades of negotiations and confidence building measures, why is the border still unresolved? Because this isn't a simple story or simply a dispute over a line of a map. It is a clash between two strategic visions. India wants to preserve its territorial status quo, and existing administrative bodies. China wants India to accept a different conception of the eastern boundary and continues to claim Arunachal Pradesh. See, please understand, both sides have domestic political stakes. Both sides have strategic concerns, and neither wants to appear to have surrendered territory. And that makes compromise extraordinarily difficult. So when you see a headline saying China angry over India's 27 new place names in Arunachal Pradesh, don't look at it mere as a naming controversy. Look at it the larger picture. A century-old boundary question, a 1962 war, the creation of Arunachal Pradesh, the Samdorong-Chu crisis, decades of confidence-building measures, the 2020 Galwan crisis, military build-up, infrastructure competition, and now a battle over maps and names. The India-China border may be quiet today compared with 1962, but quiet does not mean settled. And perhaps that is the most interesting lesson. See, the next India-China border crisis may not even begin with a gunshot. It could begin with a road, a patrol, a village, or even a satellite image, or as we have just seen, a name on a map. And that is why Arunachal Pradesh isn't just India's northeastern frontier. It is one of the most important pieces of India-China's strategic puzzle. I hope you gained something from the lecture and you had a new perspective. Do let me know. All the very best and have a beautiful day. Thank you.